How did superhero comics go from a ridiculed genre to being the focal point of the film industry? It begins with two men, Frank Miller and Alan Moore, who were pivotal in the maturation of superhero comics that Hollywood copied. Through the prism of these two creators, we're going to track the ascent of the superhero from the comics page to pop culture staples and explore how and why it happened. Let's go back to the early 1980s and set the scene. In the United States, Frank Miller is killing it as the poster boy for superhero comics. Across the Atlantic, aspiring cartoonist Alan Moore is observing this from Northampton, England. In his late 20s, Moore's got a wife and a baby to support. After a series of dead-end jobs ranging from the horrible, cleaning toilets, working in an animal hide tannery, to the mundane, clerical work, he becomes frustrated and demoralized enough to take the plunge and quit his soul-destroying employment. He's on welfare and living in public housing. Determined not to waste his life, he has bitten the bullet and committed to pursuing his dream, which is to write and draw comics for a living, especially superhero comics. The sort of comics grown adults are sneered at for reading, but he loves. Time is ticking down. His youth is slipping away. He's hungry mouse at home, depending on him to put food on the table. This crazy comics dream had better work out. That's the weight on Alan Moore's shoulders as he sat at his typewriter. Alan Moore was born in England in 1953, which put him in the sweet spot to be just the right age for the superhero explosion of the 1960s. During Moore's childhood, comics were cheap entertainment for the masses in an era where entertainment options were slim. It was commonplace for children to enjoy comics, prior to finding alternate interests once puberty hit. Unlike the rest of his demographic, Alan Moore continued to be enamored with comics when others moved on in life. While knowing Reap Daggle was the alter ego of Chameleon Boy from the Legion of Superheroes was essential for nerd credibility, such knowledge had no value in the outside world. In fact, it was the sort of thing that got you scorned by society at large. Being steeped in comics lore didn't pay the bills. Fortunately, Moore's interests were far broader than comics. Growing up with little money in a working-class family in Northampton, reading was his passport to the world. Moore had no internet, computers, or ubiquitous television to occupy his time. He educated and entertained himself by insatiably reading everything from the classics to Superman, which was just as well as his formal education came to an abrupt end when he was expelled from high school for dealing LSD in 1970. In addition to dealing, Moore partook of plenty of LSD himself. How does the saying go? Never get high on your own supply. From there, he fell into a succession of unfulfilling jobs. The sort of things people do because they have to survive as the life slowly bleeds out of you. He marries in 1974. He's trapped on the rat race treadmill that is life. Surviving, going nowhere. Moore set himself apart from the rest of humanity in refusing to accept his fate. Unable to face the prospect of spending the rest of his working life doing something he hates, Moore swears off 9-to-5 employment and pledges to make a living from comics. Moore and his wife were expecting their first child, and he knew if he waited until the baby was born, he would not be brave enough to quit. Depending on your perspective, it was either a courageous decision or a foolhardy one. Betting your financial future on a career in comics was tantamount to madness. Despite all the rational reasons not to, making comics was what Alan Moore wanted to do more than anything in the world. It was a dream he shared with a small band of British men around the same age, that perhaps they could defy the odds to turn their childhood passion into a career. Earning a living from comics was much harder in the United Kingdom than it was in the United States. The market was significantly smaller, in line with the population. So too were the publishers, which were modestly sized compared to their U.S. counterparts. There were no behemoths like Marvel or DC to provide employment to hundreds of writers and artists. The talent pool of British creators was constrained by the few options for employment. As with everything, getting a job had as much to do with who you knew as how good you were. If anything, comics were even more derided in the UK than in America. Unlike America, where superheroes were pretty much all there was, UK comics were more diverse when it came to genres. The other major difference was that comics in the UK were anthologies, made up of multiple short stories by different creative teams, rather than one long story by a single creative team. That made it harder for a writer or artist to get a single, regular assignment that paid all the bills. Instead, they had to string small jobs together to make a living wage. And British comics also paid less than their American counterparts. Working for Marvel and DC was the impossible dream for Moore and his contemporaries. Aside from the promise of money, the attraction was the chance to work on iconic American characters. British comics did not have any characters of the same legendary, global status as Superman, Batman, or Spider-Man. As boys, Alan Moore and his ilk had grown up idolizing American superheroes. British creators like Brian Bolland, Dave Gibbons, Paul Neary, Alan Davis, and Mark Farmer could only look wistfully at the promised land that was U.S. comics as they attempted to forge careers in their homeland. Frank Miller gingerly walked down the corridor from editor Denny O'Neil's office to the office of Jim Shooter, editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. The big kahuna. Miller walked into Shooter's office and said something to the effect of, "Jim, I think I need to kill Elektra." Shooter was taken aback. This Miller kid had been a boon for Shooter, making the struggling Daredevil title a hit. No one saw that coming, and Miller had garnered critical acclaim along the way, which was a rarity for Marvel. Shooter had been good for Miller, too. He'd given Miller his big break and tutored the kid in comic storytelling. With Miller's work growing in sophistication, he was moving beyond Shooter's old-school, straightforward approach to comics. "But she's more popular than Daredevil," Shooter said incredulously, just as Denny O'Neil had. Miller launched into the rationale for Elektra's proposed death that he'd given Denny O'Neil. Death was the only outcome that would allow Elektra to maintain her resonance. A glorious death was preferable to the immortal blandness that was the fate of a supporting character in comics. Elektra would be like a comet across the night sky, fleeting, yet never forgotten. Shooter was sympathetic to Miller's argument. He needed more information to make up his mind. "Tell me a story, Frank," Shooter requested. Miller told Shooter how he would end Elektra's tale, breaking it down beat by beat. Shooter listened, assessing. By the conclusion of Miller's tale, Shooter loved it. He declared Marvel would publish it in a double-sized issue to maximize the impact. Frank Miller returned to Denny O'Neil's office to tell Denny that Elektra was going to die. Jim Shooter had his share of foibles as a human being. Many of the Marvel staffers under his management did not care for him, whatever his faults. At his core, Shooter was a comics guy through and through. The story was everything. And Frank Miller had one hell of a story to tell about Elektra. The tale, percolating in Frank Miller's mind, became Daredevil 181, which came out in December of 1981. Decades on from its release, it remains one of the best single issues Marvel has ever published. It had superheroes, peppered with elements of the crime genre and a touch of noir. Like an action movie, except a little too stylish and smart for most of Hollywood's output. The menace of Bullseye looms large over the issue. Bullseye burns for vengeance on Daredevil. Elektra stands in his way. It came down to Elektra versus Bullseye. As the cover speculated, one does indeed win, and one dies. This issue had it all. Hope, love, hate, violence, brutality, loss, pain, despair. Ultimately, no one wins in this story. Everyone winds up ruined or dead by the end. Daredevil 181 was life in 38 pages of newsprint. Miller's first masterpiece. Daredevil 182 served as an epilogue to the story. A grief-stricken Matt Murdock is unable to come to terms with Elektra's death. Only after visiting the cemetery in the dead of night and exhuming her corpse is he able to accept Elektra is gone. "I loved her," Murdock says as he walks away from the grave. So did Frank Miller. He couldn't let go of Elektra either. Alan Moore's earliest paid comics work appeared not in comics, but rather in British music magazines. Moore had surveyed the publishing landscape and noted those that paid for comics and sent in samples. He also began writing and drawing a humor strip, Maxwell the Magic Cat, in a weekly newspaper in Northampton. Between his meager income from these comics and unemployment benefits, Moore was managing to scrape together enough to survive. Moore was primarily an artist at this stage, either both writing and drawing these strips or providing only art, with his friend Steve Moore, who was not related, handling the writing duties. As with Frank Miller, Moore's earliest output gives no indication a new superstar has arrived. What became quickly apparent to Moore was that he was not going to be able to earn a decent living as a cartoonist. He was too slow at drawing. Art is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. An artist can see an image in his head and then spend days crafting to get it down on paper. Conversely, writing is 99% inspiration and 1% perspiration. Alan Moore saw his future lay in writing comics rather than drawing them. Moore's first gig solely as a writer was a backup strip in Doctor Who Weekly magazine, published by Marvel's UK subsidiary. Alan's friend, Steve Moore, was writing the lead feature and suggested Alan to the editor. Though not much of a fan of Doctor Who, Alan Moore jumped at the opportunity. His first work appeared in June of 1980. Though he only got a few pages per issue, he was officially a professional comics writer. In an effort to gain additional writing work, Alan Moore submitted a Judge Dredd script to Weekly Comic Magazine, 2000 AD. Editor Alan Grant read Moore's submission. 2000 AD did not need any more Judge Dredd stories, being perfectly happy with the one John Wagner, the regular writer, was producing. But Alan Grant could see Alan Moore had potential, so he asked Moore to write a couple of Future Shocks. Future Shocks were one-off stories of around 5 pages in length used as filler in 2000 AD. Moore's first attempts at Future Shocks were also rebuffed. Even the very best face rejection and failure. No one makes it without the requisite resilience. Undeterred, Moore revised his Future Shocks, and they were accepted. Alan Moore's Future Shock stories started showing up in 2000 AD in March of 1981. Over the next couple of years, Moore eked out a living writing tiny stories. Telling a story in 6 pages was challenging. It was not what Moore wanted to be doing. He craved sufficient space to tell epics. Beggars can't be choosers, though. He had to take what he was given. In retrospect, Moore has come to realize that these short stories were the best training in the craft of comics writing he could have had. Squeezing a beginning, middle, and dramatic ending into a mere handful of pages was a definite skill. If you could weave a satisfying tale in such a truncated space, you could do anything. In the course of writing dozens of short stories, Moore had the opportunity to work with a good many of the artists on the British comics scene. Among them was an artist named Dave Gibbons. A few years older than Moore, Gibbons was considered among the best of the British artists. Having trained as a surveyor prior to comics, Gibbons brought a scientific precision to his art. While not the slickest or most dynamic of artists, where Gibbons excelled was the believability of the worlds he drew. He made it eminently feasible to accept the story was real. Moore and Gibbons collaborated on a short story called Chronicops in 2000 AD. Crammed into 5 pages, Moore weaved a complicated tale of time paradoxes, and Gibbons executed matching visuals with his trademark clarity. Chronicops was an early example of how Alan Moore's mind had the capacity to perceive the world in a different way from the norm and communicate that dissonance to others in a story with emotional resonance. It was a complex script that Gibbons handled with aplomb. Gibbons recognized Moore to be a very good writer indeed. Moore knew, in Gibbons, he had someone who could convincingly portray anything thrown at him. Gibbons and Moore regularly met up at monthly gatherings of the Society of Strip Illustration, which was basically a social club for comics professionals, in London, and became friends. Alan Moore credits his mentor, the slightly older Steve Moore, with teaching him how to write for comics. It is evident Alan very quickly progressed from being the pupil to the master. There was no universal format for writing a comic script. The most common format employed for a comic script at the time was the Marvel method. This utilized a simplified plot from the writer, roughly outlining the story. A full issue might be described in as little as a couple of typewritten pages. Again, there were no set rules. Some writers might use a paragraph to convey each page's contents. At the simplest, a plot might read, pages 4 to 7, they fight. Using the Marvel method, much of the storytelling heavy lifting was left up to the artist. Once the artist drew penciled pages from the plot, the art was returned to the writer, who then scripted dialogue and captions to suit the visuals. The Marvel method was the brainchild of Stan Lee, editor-in-chief and lead writer for Marvel in the 1960s, to enable him to write a dozen titles a month. Artists such as Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby, and John Romita took the responsibility for storytelling to be part of their job. It sped up the process of making a comic, facilitating the assembly line that was necessary for getting them out on a monthly basis. The argument against the Marvel method was that the artist was doing half the work of the writer without being acknowledged or paid as such. DC Comics had traditionally used a script format that had much in common with a screenplay for a movie. The script was reasonably comprehensive, with short panel descriptions and character dialogue. An artist drawing from such a script had much of the storytelling already done. It was merely a matter of converting text into pictures. Alan Moore had devised his own, unique method of writing a comic script, which essentially involved throwing in everything, including the kitchen sink. No one wrote a script quite like Alan Moore. He specified the number of panels per page and their arrangement. Then his description of each panel contained the camera angle, dialogue, character appearance, clothing, lighting, aromas, and on and on. We could be here for days. A single panel might have a full typewritten page detailing what it contained. Moore's scripts were tomes. They contained everything an artist could possibly need, and then some. Moore had thought everything through and wanted it there on the penciled page. While Moore's scripts were designed to give him as much control over the finished art that a writer could have, in the spirit of collaboration, he would often end his voluminous descriptions with, or if you have a better idea, just do that. His scripts were a combination of a set of directions and a personal letter to the artist. Of course, there was no one true right way to write a script for a comic. All methods have yielded everything from terrible to tremendous results. Like everything, it depends on the people involved. Some artists reveled in the freedom of the Marvel method, finding the challenge of telling a story the highlight of the job. Slavishly following the directions of an Alan Moore script like an art robot was torture for them. Dave Gibbons was among the camp of artists who preferred having the minutiae Alan Moore provided, as it gave them a full grasp of the writer's intentions. His ability to think visually, as was evident from his scripts, was what made Moore a unicorn. He not only concocted a plot, he planned out how to tell the story in a visual manner. It was clear that, as an artist himself, Moore was drawing these stories in his head. In fact, Moore did little thumbnail sketches for his own benefit, so he could see how his scripts played out. Beyond telling an impactful story, Moore was fascinated by how a sequential narrative could be used to communicate information. Moore took great joy in exploiting techniques that could work only in comics, not any other medium. In amusing himself with his exploration of what was possible in comics, Moore could in turn wow the reader.
Whenever I think of comic books, you always imagine the artist, the people who draw the book. But you need to write the story first, don't you?
Sure, yeah, and I more or less do it as you do a screenplay. I sort of tell the artists and writers where to put their pencils and pens and, you know, what people are doing, what they're saying, what they're looking like.
Did you actually doodle? Did you attempt ever to draw stuff when you were in school before you got into writing?
I made a living doing it for 2 years before I realised that I couldn't draw, which was a bit of a shock to the system. So that's when I switched to writing, because I could do that much more easily and much more quickly.
You start off with, God, this is like a school essay, isn't it?
That's right.
This is the script?
Yeah, this is the script. It's just a list of directions for the artist, and then whatever dialogue the characters are saying. You know, I just set up the whole scene and give all the little details and things to the artist, and they take it from there.
Right, so it's actually quite workmanlike. You've got to sit down. It's not the fun of doodling. Now then the artist takes hold of it and pencils it and then inks it.
Sure.
And you see it, you get it coming back like that. You get an idea, like a black and white movie, I suppose.
Outside of comics, in what we call real life, Alan Moore was an unconventional soul by some measures. Perhaps that's where the idiosyncratic insight evident in his writing came from. Physically, he was tall with long, dark hair and a flowing beard that was his defining feature. Appearance-wise, he has been described as looking like the mad monk Rasputin. Mentally, he was wicked smart, which may have contributed to his capacity to perceive the world differently from others. Or maybe it was just the drugs. He did a lot of drugs. In his younger years, there was the LSD that led to the premature end of his formal education. Moore credits LSD with granting him the awareness that what we perceive as reality is merely a social construct and, as such, could be altered simply by changing one's mindset. And there was marijuana. He smoked an awful lot of weed. There were magic mushrooms in the mix, and who knows what else. You get the idea. Early in 1981, Alan Moore and his wife's second child was born. He was 27 years old with a wife and 2 children. He was going nowhere fast, getting by writing short stories for 2000 AD in Marvel UK. Something had to change. Moore's opportunity came in 1982, when he got his first decent crack at a superhero. Alan Moore was such a strong writer that he could generate superior stories regardless of genre. For the first couple of years of his writing career, Moore's output was largely science fiction, as that's what he was offered and where the market was at. There were numerous examples of great science fiction stories. If not in comics, then in novels or movies. It was harder to stand out from the crowd in science fiction as the competition was fierce. Truly great superhero stories, though, there hadn't been any in the history of the genre. Ever. Frank Miller's Daredevil, currently a work in progress, was shaping up as the first. The superhero market was ripe for disruption, though no one was thinking about it in those terms at the time. Most people considered superhero comics to be a laughingstock, not a forum for serious artistic expression. A new comics company was starting, going by the name of Quality Communications. Des Skin was the man behind Quality Communications. Skin was comics royalty in Britain, having started out in fandom and worked his way up to heading Marvel UK. After parting ways with Marvel UK, Skin set up his own publishing venture, Quality. No doubt Skin was hoping to stick it to his old employer. Quality's flagship was to be a monthly anthology comics magazine entitled Warrior. With Quality being an independent startup, Skin couldn't afford to pay writers and artists the page rates they could get from 2000 AD or Marvel UK. As a lure to attract talent, he was offering more creative freedom, ownership of characters, and payment when stories were reprinted. All perks other publishers did not allow. And Warrior had a secret weapon. If he were to compete with Marvel, Skin strategized Warrior needed a superhero with some name recognition. Skin had, or at least said he had, obtained the rights to Britain's first superhero, Marvelman. Created in 1954, Marvelman was a lame copy of Captain Marvel, who was himself a ripoff of Superman. By 1963, Marvelman had been canceled, put out of business by the much better superhero comics imported into Britain from Marvel and DC. The character had lain dormant ever since, and by this time had not been cited for nearly 2 decades. Alan Moore had given an interview in the Journal of the Society of Strip Illustration in 1981, in which the nascent writer stated his dream project was to bring back Marvelman, who at that time was ancient history. Having Marvelman for Warrior was a mild coup. Marvelman was a piece of nostalgia that had disappeared before most of the readers of Warrior were even born. Few outside of Alan Moore were clamoring for the return of Marvelman. Des Skin was not familiar with Alan Moore and had other writers in mind for his planned Marvelman revival. Skin sought a more established writer, such as Steve Parkhouse or Steve Moore. When Skin asked Steve Moore about writing Marvelman, Steve Moore responded he had a friend who would give anything to write the character. Skin was skeptical, but asked Alan Moore to submit a proposal for Marvelman. The proposal Alan Moore submitted stunned Des Skin. Moore outlined his plan to make Marvelman the definitive superhero strip, a rather bold ambition for a writer taking on his first superhero assignment. Skin was sufficiently impressed with Moore's proposal to give him a shot at pulling it off. Marvelman was Alan Moore's first published attempt at writing an ongoing superhero story for the comics market. Even then, he was going to have to do it in little chunks of 6 to 8 pages every month. No luxuriating in 22 pages of story per month like American writers got to play with. He had to tell a satisfying story in a handful of pages. To draw Marvelman, Skin hoped to land one of the leading British superhero artists to pair with Moore. They weren't exactly lining up for the job. Brian Bolland? Sorry, unavailable. Dave Gibbons? Sorry, haven't got the time. In the end, Gary Leach got the gig. Leach was a fine artist, though lacked the name recognition of the other candidates. Through a happy little accident, Brian Bolland had actually started achieving what had been considered impossible in working for DC Comics while living in England. DC Comics artist Joe Staton and his wife were spending the summer of 1979 in England. Staton still needed to get his regular assignment drawing Green Lantern done while traveling. Comics artists didn't make big bucks, and he couldn't afford to take the summer off. Needing studio space to draw, Staton hooked up with local artist Brian Bolland to get access to facilities. Recognizing that Bolland could draw better than him, Staton contacted his editor, Jack Harris, and communicated that Bolland was a fan of Green Lantern and would like to draw a cover. Bolland was assigned a cover, which appeared on the front of a Green Lantern issue in early 1980. Over the next couple of years, Bolland kept busy doing bits and pieces for DC. As long as the deadlines weren't too onerous, the logistics were manageable. Artist David Lloyd had been tasked by Des Skin with coming up with a masked vigilante for Warrior, based on the Night Raven character appearing in Marvel UK Comics. Having worked with Alan Moore on Doctor Who Comics, Lloyd knew Moore's talent and invited Moore to join him on the strip. Alan Moore was now writing 2 strips for Warrior. This strip was to be something completely different, titled V for Vendetta. Rooted closer to reality than the superhero shenanigans of Marvelman, V for Vendetta told of a lone individual attempting to bring about revolution in an alternate reality Britain that's gone down the path of George Orwell's 1984. Seemed highly relevant to avowed anarchist Moore, who vehemently opposed Margaret Thatcher's government at the time. The remainder of Warrior was to be filled with strips by more established comics creators, with genres ranging from science fiction to sword and sorcery. A cross-section of genres designed to offer something for everyone. Prior to release, Des Skin anticipated Axel Pressbutton, starring a violent cyborg with the head of actor Ernest Borgnine, would emerge as the most popular feature in Warrior. On November 17, 1981, DC Comics made an announcement with monumental implications for comics. DC were going to begin paying royalties to writers and artists based on the sales figures of comics. A royalty of 4% would be paid on sales over 100,000 copies of an issue. The writer and artist would divide the 4% royalty between them. It didn't amount to a huge windfall. The writers and artists might split a couple of $1,000s between them. Better than nothing, though, and it was a huge sign of respect for creators. It was also the first acknowledgement from a major publisher that talent helped sell a book. At last, there was a financial incentive for writers and artists to do good work. Marvel quickly responded with a royalty plan of its own, of course, to prevent an outflow of talent to DC. According to Jim Shooter, he had been trying to implement a royalty program for years, without support from upper management. The royalty plan was good news for Frank Miller, who stood to be justly rewarded for the lofty sales his talent and hard work had brought Daredevil. When the premiere issue of Warrior hit the stands in March of 1982, it had a cover dominated by Axel Pressbutton. Marvelman did not appear on the cover, outside of an unidentified silhouette in the corner. This was to not spoil the surprise of Marvelman's return on the interior pages. Once inside the magazine, it was clear who the superstar was going to be. Somehow Alan Moore reinvented Marvelman and laid the groundwork for redefining the concept of the superhero in just 8 pages. The key to Moore's approach was unprecedented realism. Essentially, he was asking the question, what would it really be like for a superhero to exist in our world? Alan Moore takes Richard Donner's verisimilitude from Superman, the movie, and layers on intellect and a dash of sex and violence. In the hands of a genius, the concept is captivating. Moore had returned the sense of wonder to the superhero. It wasn't normal for people to fly through the air or lift trucks or fire energy bolts. Comics routinely treated such phenomena as mundane. Moore's Marvelman made it seem amazing that anything of the sort could occur, which was as it should be. Gary Leach's art was gorgeous, clearly heavily photo-referenced. It took Leach an eternity to complete. Leach based Marvelman's facial appearance on that of actor Paul Newman. Marvelman's physique was athletic like a dancer, not bulky like a bodybuilder, which made sense, as Marvelman was supposed to be real, not a monster inflated by anabolic steroids. Buried deeper in the pages of the premiere issue of Warrior was the first episode of Alan Moore and artist David Lloyd's V for Vendetta. The mysterious protagonist, known only as V, was a cross between Guy Fawkes and Batman. Was he freedom fighter or terrorist? Depends on your perspective. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Alan Moore showed he could weave magic with a character of his own creation, without reliance on superhero tropes. Marvelman was no fluke. As for the remaining strips in that bravura debut issue of Warrior, well, they were okay. Perfectly competent and professional. Just overshadowed by the exceptional works of Alan Moore. There was no shame in that. The superstar revealed in the premiere issue of Warrior wasn't Marvelman. It was Alan Moore. Given his first chances at ongoing strips, he initiated 2 stories that had the makings of classics. With Marvelman, he reimagined a clunky, forgotten property as the future of superheroes. In V for Vendetta, he proved he could generate a viable concept of his own from scratch. Right out of the gate, Alan Moore had 2 winners on his hands. Hold on for the ride. This could be something special. Dave Gibbons followed in the footsteps of Brian Bolland in working remotely for DC Comics from England. After a smattering of small assignments, Gibbons became the regular artist on the monthly Green Lantern title. Bolland was also tackling a regular monthly title, Camelot 3000, which was a futuristic interpretation of the King Arthur legend. The relationship between British talent and DC continued to evolve organically over several years. Editors from DC would attend UK conventions, either in an official capacity or while holidaying, and make connections with the local talent. DC was starting to recognize the UK could be a talent stream for artists. Some of the older DC artists in the US were on the cusp of aging out. Reinforcements would be needed to cover the impending retirements. DC formalized its recruitment strategy by sending a couple of executives, Dick Giordano and Joe Orlando, to give a presentation at a Society of Strip Illustration meeting. British artists were predisposed to listen favorably to overtures from DC's talent scouts. There was a lot of penned-up resentment toward the British comics publishers. There were many sore points. British publishers did not allow creators to own intellectual property. They did not return original artwork to artists. They did not supply drawing materials. American comics publishers had many flaws themselves, but were slightly more progressive. And the U.S. publishers had money. DC sponsored a dinner for the British artists at the swanky Savoy Hotel in London. The discrepancy was not lost on British creators, who struggled to get a complimentary Big Mac out of the UK publishers. A favorable exchange rate between the dollar and the pound contributed to DC's ability to pay more than the local publishers. Note that DC was searching for artists from Britain, not writers. Artists were always more in demand than writers. A writer can produce multiple comics a month with ease. For most artists, drawing 1 book a month was a strain. And skillful writing simply wasn't valued to the same degree that art was. Around the same time as Warrior happened, Alan Moore expanded his output from Marvel UK. He took over the Captain Britain strip in Marvel Superheroes, an anthology book which was Warrior's direct competitor. As the name suggests, Captain Britain was a patriotic hero in the vein of Captain America. Drawing Captain Britain was Alan Davis, an excellent young artist at the start of his career. While not revolutionary in the way Marvelman was, Moore's Captain Britain strip told a stirring yarn. Once again, Moore took a silly pre-existing hero and revamped it to yield something fresh and exciting. The villain named Fury that Moore introduced to hunt down Captain Britain was truly terrifying. Fury was an unstoppable killing machine. It was a cyborg, whose sole purpose was to kill Captain Britain. Alan Davis came to the party with a grotesque design for Fury that was unsettling to look at. The character is similar in tone to James Cameron's Terminator, though Fury is scarier and predates the Terminator. A couple of issues into Moore's run, Captain Britain was shifted into a new anthology book, Daredevils. The aptly named Daredevils reprinted stories from Frank Miller's Daredevil run. Frank Miller and Alan Moore together in one comic. It did not get any better. In one issue of Daredevils, Moore wrote a praiseworthy text piece on Miller's work. Clearly, he was a fan of his American counterpart. Gary Leach relinquished penciling duties on Marvelman after issue 5, as he was unable to keep up with the deadline. Replacing Leach was none other than Alan Davis. This meant there were two major British superhero strips in progress, both being done by Alan Moore and Alan Davis. As his reputation grew, Moore added additional strips to his workload. He was now in demand in his homeland. There was a third strip in Warrior, named the Bo Jeffrey Saga, and two ongoing strips in 2000 AD, most of which seemed more like Alan Moore having fun and spreading his wings than trying to reinvent the comics medium. Can't blame him. A man's got to make a living. Everything can't be revolutionary. There are only so many revolutions to be had. The real prize for Moore was to work in American comics. He was doing what he could to bring himself to the attention of DC Comics. Teaming up with Dave Gibbons, Moore submitted a proposal to DC for the pair to do a series featuring the Challengers of the Unknown. The Challengers of the Unknown were an obscure group of adventurers created in the 1950s who had never met with any significant commercial success. Sorry, DC told them. The Challengers have been promised to another creative team. DC didn't waste any time reading the proposal, which Dave Gibbons thought was excellently written. Undeterred, Moore and Gibbons tried a second time. This time they pitched a series starring John Johns, the Martian Manhunter, an obscure DC hero created in the 1950s who had never met with any significant commercial success. Sensing a pattern here? Moore and Gibbons were targeting obscure characters they had nostalgia for. They probably figured DC weren't going to entrust the likes of Superman or Batman to a couple of foreign novices. To continue the pattern, DC told them, sorry, Martian Manhunter has been promised to another creative team. Once again, DC didn't waste any time actually reading the pitch, which Dave Gibbons thought was excellently written. Around the same time frame, DC executive Paul Levitz, who served as vice president of operations in addition to writing DC's second most popular book, The Legion of Superheroes, read a letter in his New York apartment. The author introduced himself as the best comics writer in England. If DC needed anyone to write a Martian Manhunter book, the author would be happy to accommodate them. The letter was signed by Alan Moore. After Elektra's death, Frank Miller continued producing Daredevil issues with the same high level of craft. While fine stories, they felt like Miller was marking time. There weren't the monumental stakes as there had been when Elektra was alive. Really, there couldn't be. Then, with issue 187, the urgency was back. Stick returned, along with his nemesis, the evil ninja group known as the Hand. We are introduced to the Chaste, a small band of good ninjas led by Stick. The Hand and the Chaste are engaged in a war to destroy each other. And Kirigi, the Hand's fearsome assassin, was back. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking that having his head chopped off by Elektra would have spelled the end for Kirigi. Apparently, though, decapitation wasn't enough to keep a bad man down. 4 of the Hand's ninjas sacrificed themselves to resurrect Kirigi with their life force. Kirigi's first target was Stick. Phase 2 of the Elektra saga was underway and Frank Miller was back in the groove. Decades later, Miller stated that although proud of his Daredevil run, he was writing a novel without realizing it, making it up as he went along. There was no notion of planning out a great arc. If he had it to do over again, there were things he would do differently with the benefit of hindsight. The lull between the phases of the Elektra saga might well be one of things he'd change. Daredevil, Black Widow, and the 4 members of the Chaste, Stick, Stone, Shaft, and Claw, stage a final stand against an army of ninjas from the Hand. Kirigi goes down early, shuffling off this mortal coil for a third time when the chase team up to make short work of him. This time, they destroy the body to prevent another resurrection. Third time's the charm. Preposterously outnumbered, our heroes fight valiantly. Overwhelmed by the enemy's superior numbers, Claw is killed. Facing impossible odds, Stick and Shaft sacrifice themselves to save the others. Mystically siphoning the life force of dozens of the Hand ninjas into themselves, Stick and Shaft explode, unable to contain the energy within their mortal bodies. Only Daredevil, Black Widow, and Stone remain alive to continue the war against the Hand. Stone, the sole survivor of the chase, deduces that the Hand will seek out a lead assassin to replace Kirigi. Kirigi was really dead this time. There was no coming back from having your beaten, lifeless corpse obliterated. Not even ninja magic was that potent. As luck would have it, the Hand did have a powerful champion in New York City. She was currently dead and buried in the cemetery. Nothing the Hand couldn't resolve. The appeal of superhero comics is easy to see. You die, you come back to life. Not a big deal. Death is not an impediment. The Hand exhume Elektra's body and are conducting a resurrection ceremony when Daredevil, Black Widow, and Stone arrive. Daredevil abandons his allies and attempts to revive Elektra's body by transferring some of his life energy into her. Lacking the proper training, Daredevil fails. Only the timely arrival of the Kingpin and his machine gun-wielding henchmen saves the day. Shuriken-wielding ninjas prove to be no match for Uzi-wielding gangsters. While everyone else evacuates the burning building, Stone detects Elektra's soul has been purified by Daredevil's love. Sacrificing himself, Stone resurrects Elektra. Rushing back into the burning building to save Stone, Daredevil and Black Widow find no one inside. Daredevil assumes Stone has taken Elektra's body to destroy it. Black Widow finds Stone's empty robes and realizes what has occurred. Motivated by her love of Daredevil, she conceals the truth from him. At some time in the future, a purified Elektra, now clad in the white of the chaste, is at a locale far, far away. She too thinks Daredevil must never know she is alive. Their destinies lie separately. Frank Miller did one more issue of Daredevil after the Elektra saga concluded. He came back to the art and did full pencils, which he had not done for 18 months. Instead of Klaus Janson on inks, Terry Austin was brought in for the issue. Terry Austin was considered by many to be the best inker in all of comics. Somehow, although undeniably beautiful, Austin's precise inking did not gel with Miller's pencils as congruently as Janson's more organic line. Art mimics life. Different people go better together, for no particular reason. Daredevil 191 was a fine issue. The story was fine. The art was fine. Really, though, for all intents and purposes, Miller's run ended the issue before with the finale of the Elektra saga. That's where the heart and soul was. Frank Miller's last issue of his groundbreaking Daredevil run came out in October of 1982. At age 25, he had been writing the book for 2 years and drawing it for 10 months before that. His work sold like hotcakes, and many fans considered his Daredevil run the best in the history of superhero comics. Impressive for a young man still learning his craft. How do you follow that up? His success have given Miller a lot of clout. Clout that very few comics creators had ever experienced. Miller had options and didn't want to squander the position he found himself in. The safe move would have been a shift to a guaranteed bestseller like the X-Men or Spider-Man and live comfortably off the royalties. Miller had something far grander in mind. He wanted to expand beyond the narrow confines of superheroes, escape the grind of a monthly title, elevate the production values of the printed comics in which his work was presented to something akin to the upmarket comics he'd seen coming out of Europe. Thicker, whiter paper, more realistic coloring. Most importantly, he wanted to own his work. He wanted comics publishers to be more like book publishers, who did not own an author's work. Book publishers merely bought the right to print an author's work. Miller wanted the latitude to tell the stories he wanted to tell, not the stories Marvel wanted him to tell with their characters. What Miller really wanted was freedom, an ambitious goal, Now he had to figure out how to make it a reality. It's fair to summarize Warrior magazine as an artistic triumph, but a financial disappointment. It was losing money all the way. Writers and artists lost faith in Skin over disputes around ownership of characters or lack of payment. Where deadlines were missed, it was not possible to use fill-in artists as the characters were owned by the regular team. Alan Moore and Alan Davis fell out, causing work on Marvelman to cease before the end of Warrior's run. While Skin had an egalitarian plan to share profits with creators, that amounted to literally nothing when there were no profits. The cornerstone of Skin's financial strategy for Warrior was to sell the material as a package to a U.S. publisher for reprinting in that market. That way, Warrior's creators would get paid twice for the same material, with Skin pocketing a cut for acting as their agent. Marvel and DC, the big guns with all the money, were the obvious targets for Skin. Unfortunately, Marvel and DC weren't buying. At Marvel, Jim Shooter told Skin that Marvel could not publish Marvelman, what with the sex and violence the strip contained. Especially since the hero's name inferred Marvelman was the company's flagship character. And Dick Giordano informed Skin there was no way DC could publish a character by the name of Marvelman. Over the course of its short life, Warrior devolved from a utopian ideal to a train wreck. The only thing guaranteed was that if Marvelman and V for Vendetta were in an issue, they would be better written than anything else on the stands. As the threads unraveled, the various writers and artists involved began looking increasingly fervently for exit strategies to get off the sinking Titanic. One day in May of 1983, Alan Moore was at home in Northampton when the phone rang. Alan answered. The voice on the line said, in an American accent, that he was Len Wein, editor at DC Comics. Alan Moore hung up. A perplexed Len Wein assumed the transatlantic call had been cut off and phoned back. Once again, he introduced himself as Len Wein. Who was it really? Alan Moore asked. He was certain one of his mates was prank calling him. Surely Len Wein would not know who Alan Moore was, let alone his phone number. It took Len Wein a bit to convince Alan Moore it was indeed Len Wein, editor at DC Comics in New York City. Len had a proposition for Alan. Len Wein had gotten Alan Moore's phone number from Dave Gibbons, who worked with Wein on Green Lantern. Wein had read Moore's work in 2000 AD in Warrior. The writer on DC's Swamp Thing comic was departing, and Wein was looking around for a replacement. It was an unprecedented step to hire a foreigner to write from abroad. Would Alan Moore like to write Swamp Thing for DC Comics? Alan Moore would. More than just about anything. That was getting called up to the major league. Writing for DC Comics was a dream come true for a kid from Northampton who loved American superhero comics. Alan Moore's Marvelman was the template for the transformation of superheroes from cardboard cutouts into something recognizable as real people. Marvelman conveyed what it was to be human by showing what it would truly be like to be something more than human. With his first published superhero, Alan Moore redefined what the genre could be. In not many pages, for a precious little financial reward. Moore's ambition at the outset was to devise the definitive superhero strip. Had he achieved the goal? Quite possibly. And he was just getting warmed up. Now, what could he do with Swamp Thing?
Now, you're from Britain, but you're now writing for big American comic companies. How did that come about?
Well, they just pull up in a big Chevrolet and said, "Kid, would you like to be a star?" And I said, "Sure." You know, and I suppose it was basically that they just saw a lot of the work I've been doing for Britain and the awards I've been getting, and just decided that I might not be too bad taking over one of their titles.
Strangely enough, for a character that did not sell well in comics, Swamp Thing had recently starred in his own movie. Entertainment lawyer and former DC employee Michael Uslan obtained the movie rights to Batman in 1979. Uslan had zero competition for the license to Batman. No one other than rabid fans like Uslan thought comics characters could succeed on film. Unable to find a studio interested in making Batman, Uslan came back to license Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing wasn't even being published at the time, his title having been canceled in 1976. Courtesy of Bernie Wrightson's stellar art, Swamp Thing was well regarded in certain circles, which included Uslan. Uslan knew Swamp Thing was an easier sell in Hollywood, as it fit neatly into conventional horror movie tropes. Cheap monster movies were something Hollywood understood. There was no superhero stigma attached. Uslan obtained the rights to Swamp Thing for next to nothing because Warner Publishing, who owned DC Comics, thought Swamp Thing was worthless. Such was the contempt in which comics were held, that the publishing arm thought Hollywood was doing them a favor. Why would a legitimate business and art form have any interest in a stupid, juvenile comic like Swamp Thing? Just the attention from Hollywood was flattering. Worse, a contract that has been described as the worst licensing deal DC ever signed gave Uslan rights to future Swamp Thing stories and characters appearing in the title. With the attachment of director Wes Craven, the Swamp Thing movie got made in 1982. The impending release of the movie encouraged DC to bring Swamp Thing back in his own title, in the hope of capturing some of the movie's buzz. When the movie came out, it was terrible. There was no associated buzz. The comic languished as one of DC's lowest sellers. That's where it was at as Alan Moore arrived on the scene. Superman 3, the 1983 entry in the prototypical superhero franchise, failed at the box office, effectively ending Christopher Reeve's storied Superman tenure. For some reason, the producers decided to make Superman 3 into a Richard Pryor comedy, as if they had no faith in Superman carrying his own movie. Like when Paramount planned to put Eddie Murphy in Star Trek 4, figuring they'd capture both audiences. Unfortunately, Superman 3 was neither funny nor dramatic and deserved to fail. It was a return to the bad old days of not treating superheroes seriously. While superhero comics were making advances thanks to Frank Miller and Alan Moore, superhero movies were in the doldrums.